As I live, saith the Lord God, I have no pleasure in the death of the wicked, but that the wicked turn from his way and live. Turn ye from your evil ways, for why will ye die?
I was raised without religion. One side of the family, long ago, Catholic, I think. The other side, Jewish. I've never been in a synagogue. I don't believe in a higher power. I'm instinctively hostile to any kind of devotion. Certainty is my enemy. You know, I'm all about doubt, questioning oneself and the nature of reality constantly.
Tears stream down Rose McGowan's face as she speaks out about the shocking suicide of her friend Anthony Bourdain. The 61-year-old host of CNN's Parts Unknown hanged himself just 3 days after designer Kate Spade took her life in the same manner.
The world will not be better off without you. Anthony, why?
From an atheist perspective, why not? Why shouldn't people kill themselves? Robin Williams told us in Dead Poets Society that we and all we do are nothing more than food for the worms, so we should seize the day. But what should we do when the day is no longer worth seizing? When instead of light, it only offers darkness? What should we do when friends and lovers disappoint? When career and fame can no longer fill the emptiness within us? What do we do when we can no longer busy ourselves enough to ignore our own overwhelming despair? Atheism can offer drugs and distractions, but no real purpose for going on.
The universe we observe has precisely the properties we should expect if there is, at bottom, no design, no purpose, no evil and no good, nothing but blind, pitiless indifference.
We are natural organisms in a natural environment, and that's all we are, and that's good enough for me. I don't feel bad knowing that. I don't feel like my life is missing something because there's not some transcendent order to it all. There is no purpose of life. In the cosmic picture, the total cosmic picture, we don't matter any more than broccoli matters.
Okay, the good news of atheism, the gospel of atheism, is essentially nothing. That nothing happens after death. There's nothing to worry about, there's nothing to fear. When after you die, you are returned to that nothingness that you were before you were born.
When logic fails them, atheists often turn to mockery.
If God does not exist, what then is the purpose of life?
Well, I can only answer for myself. What cheers me up? I suppose mainly gloating over the misfortunes of other people. I guess that has to be it. I think, yeah, mainly crowing over the miseries of others. It doesn't always work, but it never completely fails. And then there's irony. There's irony, and which is the gin in the Campari, you know, the cream in the coffee. Sex can have diminishing returns, but it's amazing. No, that's pretty much it, and then it's a clear run to the grave.
Do you realize that right this second, right now, somewhere around the world, some guy is getting ready to kill himself? Isn't that great? Isn't that great? That's probably the most interesting thing you can do with your life. End it.
Carlin could joke about suicide because he said we are nothing more than a collection of atoms, beings with no soul, no past, and no future. Biochemical organisms really only worthy of contempt. He said in his book Brain Droppings, I have more sympathy for an injured or dead animal than I do for an injured or dead human being, because human beings participate and cooperate in their own undoing. Animals are completely innocent. There are no innocent human beings. Here is an anecdote from the writer Patricia Highsmith. Not so long ago, I said to a friend of mine, if I saw a kitten and a little human baby sitting on the curb starving, I would feed the kitten first if nobody was looking. My friend said I would feed the kitten first if somebody was looking. I would too, Patricia. Atheists alternate between seeing humans as meaningless and godlike. The God of the Bible presents a radically different perspective to both.
I call heaven and earth to record this day against you, that I have set before you life and death, blessing and cursing. Therefore choose life, that both thou and thy seed may live, that thou mayest love the Lord thy God, and that thou mayest obey his voice, and that thou mayest cleave unto him. For he is thy life and the length of thy days.
We are material beings, and as Carlin says, we participate in our own undoing. But we also have souls. God created Adam from the dust of the ground, and he breathed into him the breath of life. We are unique from all the other creatures, being made in the very image of God. This image is not material, but spiritual. We are rational, personal beings, made to have fellowship with our Creator. It is this image that explains our genius. We make music and create art. We explore. We long to understand the world around us and to understand ourselves. Christians cannot joke about suicide because we understand it as a profound tragedy. It is bad enough that people make idols of sex, possessions, and fame. But when they realize that these things can never truly satisfy, they throw away their lives, rather than turn to the God who is supposed to be our life. Suicide is not simply the reorganization of atoms, but the destruction of something beautiful. George Carlin may laugh at suicide, but we weep. For all their pretenses, atheists can provide no truth, no value, and no real purpose apart from the God of the Bible. Yet they say Christians are the ones deceived, that these ideas of a God and a soul are nothing more than illusions. They call us to give up our comforting lies and face the hard truth that there is no God. But what is the illusion, and what is real? Atheists argue that if a housewife thinks she sees the Virgin Mary in a grilled cheese sandwich, all claims to the supernatural must be the same. People see what they want to see. Few are better at understanding how we can be fooled than the professional illusionist, James Randi.
Good evening. My name is the Great Randall. I'm a liar, a cheat, and a charlatan. I will blatantly lie to you, but for purposes of entertainment only, of course. And those lies may not be discernible from the truth.
Randy's experience in show business helped him to recognize that some illusionists were fooling people for purposes other than entertainment. This led to him challenging the claims of reputed psychic Uri Geller. He demonstrated that what Geller was doing was simple sleight of hand. To his surprise, many researchers didn't care that he could replicate all that Geller had done. They were professors at Stanford and other leading universities. They had PhDs and were experts in their fields. They wrapped themselves in the mantle of science and reason and convinced themselves they had not been tricked. So Randy enlisted 2 teenage illusionists. They pretended to have psychic abilities and thoroughly convinced the researchers of their powers before revealing the deception. For all the experts' claims of rationality, they were actually fooling themselves into believing what they wanted to believe. Having exposed Geller and the gullibility of scientists, Randy then turned his attention to faith healers, particularly Peter Popoff. He revealed that what were supposed to be revelations from God were actually coming from Popoff's wife through a radio earpiece.
In the name of Jesus.
Jody Dean. Jody Dean.
Is it Jody? Jody? Dean? Jody Dean?
No, she should be right there on your right side.
Here it comes.
Okay, she lives at 4267 Masterson.
4267 Masterson. I can see the angels of God all around your house. Rosa?
Come here.
Is it Camille? You've been taking a lot of medication?
She's there with her son, Kipper, and he has a lump in his chest.
Wait just a minute. Who's Kipper? He's got a lump in his chest. You want God to melt it right now? Kipper, stand up. God's going to burn that thing out right now.
Randy argues that such frauds are representative of all claims of the supernatural, and that because he has revealed others' lies, we should trust him. Along with Richard Dawkins, Sam Harris, and Christopher Hitchens, Randy is one of the champions of the new atheism. He and Dawkins have even started calling themselves Brights.
A bright is someone who thinks logically and rationally, bases his or her decisions upon rationality, upon logic, and upon evidence. That's the major thing right there. And if we don't have evidence, we can express our belief or lack of belief in it, but it has to be provisional. I believe that this is probably true, though I don't have any evidence for or against it. It's a perfectly safe statement. And so Brights base all of their decisions and their beliefs on logic, rationality, and on evidence. That's the thing in which they differ from the average person who takes anything that comes along that looks attractive. Oh, I like that. I think I'll believe in it.
Based on such supposed enlightenment, Randy not only rejects Jesus as the Son of God, but he claims that Jesus never even existed.
There are well-accepted accounts from the Bible that Christians and others never question. Events and locations that are part of the story told of Christ and his history. One such is the account in John 1 of the birth of Christ in the lower Galilee town of Nazareth. But Nazareth may be overrated as an historical site that proves the inerrancy of the Bible. Author René Salm has written The Myth of Nazareth, the Invented Town of Jesus, a book that effectively demonstrates the controversial archaeology of the town where the Bible has Jesus Christ being born. The facts are that no demonstrable evidence dating either to the time of Jesus or to earlier Hellenistic times has been found at Nazareth. It is a late Roman Byzantine village, not a mythical settlement at the turn of the era. As author Psalm says, that question has already been answered, and answered convincingly. St. Luke, and thus the inerrant Bible, was plainly, demonstrably dead wrong. Shall we also question the rest of the Holy Bible? Yes, I think so.
Atheists praise Randy's conclusions and mock Christians as ignorant rubes. One comment on his video describes the typical Christian.
If there are no facts to back up your claims, just make it up. The sheep will believe anything they are told.
The funny thing is that it's Randy who's making things up, and it's the atheists who are believing anything they're told. John's Gospel never says that Jesus was born in Nazareth, but simply that he lived there. The Bible is very clear that Jesus was born in Bethlehem, 80 miles away. Besides misrepresenting the Bible, Randy also misrepresents the archaeological evidence, even according to his fellow atheist, Bart Ehrman.
The first argument that I find completely unconvincing, that some of you have heard and maybe have found convincing, is the idea that Jesus of Nazareth could not have existed because Nazareth did not exist. There was no Nazareth. I simply have never found this argument to be anywhere close to persuasive for two reasons. One reason is, archaeologists have dug where ancient Nazareth was, and they've discovered that it was there. This is not a debated point among Palestinian archaeologists, several of which are good friends of mine. They don't debate whether Nazareth existed because they have dug it and they found it. They've uncovered a house there, they've uncovered a farm there, they've uncovered pottery there, they've uncovered coins there. The pottery and the coins date to the days of Jesus. Certainly, Nazareth did exist. It's been shown to exist. Anyone who thinks otherwise simply doesn't know the archaeological record. I'm afraid it's that simple.
Remember, Randy claimed his position had been proven
convincingly,
but it hadn't. Like the scientists who supported Geller, Randy wraps himself in the mantle of science and reason, but he fools himself into seeing what he wants to see. Such self-delusion is not incidental to atheism. It underlies all of atheism. In the same way that illusionists use sleight of hand, atheists use appeals to science. They pretend that it is the antithesis of faith and the only reliable source of knowing truth. If we accept their assertion, then God and the soul are dismissed by definition, because the scientific method is incapable of dealing with anything other than matter in motion. But such claims are absurd, because logic, math, and even the scientific method itself are also immaterial. Atheists insist that without scientific proof, it is a delusion to believe that anything could be more than opinion. But by that standard, their confidence in science is also a delusion, because science cannot prove the immaterial principles on which it is based. Pioneers in the scientific revolution were not left to such absurdities. Scientists like Isaac Newton and Johannes Kepler believed that we could have true knowledge because the God who made all things knows all things and has given us truth. He has revealed himself to be a reasonable God who made a reasonable universe. He invites us as his creatures to reason with him.
This most beautiful system of the sun, planets, and comets could only proceed from the counsel and dominion of an intelligent being. Atheism is so senseless and odious to mankind that it never had many professors.
Those laws of nature are within the grasp of the human mind. God wanted us to recognize them by creating us after his own image so that we could share in his own thoughts.
Because of their confidence that a reasonable God controls the universe, these scientists believe the principle of induction allowed them to experiment and to draw accurate conclusions from their observations. Isaac Newton observed that for every action there was an equal and opposite reaction. He concluded this was the way God typically made nature to behave, and since God is reasonable, we should expect the same to apply in the future as a law of motion. Though the scientific revolution largely flowed out of the Protestant Reformation, it's no surprise to Christians that non-Christians can also do science, because we are all made in the image of God and we live in his universe. The problem for non-Christians is that when they suppress their knowledge of God, they lose any basis for expecting induction to work. Polytheism sees the universe as under the control of competing, unpredictable gods, while pantheism sees the universe under the control of an impersonal force. Neither gives real confidence that what happens today will in any way resemble what happens tomorrow. Both tend to view history as cyclical rather than linear, and both discourage experimentation in favor of contemplation. Aristotle could write brilliant works on logic, but also argue that things that weighed twice as much fell twice as fast. China discovered many things before the Christian West, but their worldview did not give them confidence in a rational framework into which to fit these discoveries. As late as 1922, the Chinese philosopher Yu Lunfang wrote,
China has not discovered the scientific method because Chinese thought started from mind, and from one's own mind.
Rather than seeing the scientific revolution as evidence for the God of the Bible, atheists assume they can appropriate the scientific method, but jettison the God on whose existence the method is based. Their problem is that apart from the God of the Bible, they have no logical basis for trusting induction. The very idea that there are laws in nature only became popular after the year 1600. It was based on the assumption that the God of the Bible was the lawgiver. Without that God, there are no scientific laws, simply patterns of observed behavior. Those patterns may or may not be indicative of the past or the future. Atheists insist that the scientific method keeps producing positive results, even when God is rejected. But remember, they are making claims for science far beyond it being useful. They are insisting that it is self-attesting and renders faith irrational. Older atheists were not so bold. The philosopher Bertrand Russell admitted,
"All arguments which, on the basis of experience, argue as to the future or the unexperienced parts of the past or present, assume the inductive principle. Hence, we can never use experience to prove the inductive principle without begging the question. Thus, we must either accept the inductive principle on the grounds of its intrinsic evidence or forego all justification of our expectations about the future. If the principle is unsound, we have no reason to expect the sun to rise tomorrow, to expect bread to be more nourishing than a stone, or to expect that if we throw ourselves off the roof, we shall fall."
Do you understand the problem? Atheists either argue in a circle, or they have to give up on induction. They call faith evil and the antithesis of science, but they either have to accept on faith that the inductive principle is true, or they have to give up any hope of knowledge. They have to accept on faith that even without comprehensive knowledge, they can draw valid conclusions from their experiments. They then have to accept on faith that these observations not only give them truth about the nature of reality, but also prescriptions for how we are to lead our lives. When pressed with all the faith their system requires, some atheists will admit that they can't know anything with real certainty.
I can live with doubt and uncertainty and not knowing. I think it's much more interesting to live not knowing than to have answers which might be wrong. I have approximate answers and possible beliefs and different degrees of certainty about different things, but I'm not absolutely sure of anything, and then many things I don't know anything about.
From the standpoint of objective reality, the belief that there is a God is a delusion.
Do you still believe that? Yes. How do you know anything to be objectively real?
How do I know? What do you mean by know?
Well, the thing is, you made the claim that according to objective reality, belief in God is a delusion.
Yes, I'm stating what my belief is
Right.
about reality.
But you said according to objective reality.
Yes, I believe it's objective.
Okay, so how do you know anything to be objectively real when you've admitted you could be a brain in a vat?
What do you mean by know? Do you mean how am I aware of?
Right, how are you aware of objective reality?
I'm aware of reality through my senses.
Okay, how about this? Why don't you tell me one thing you know?
Why?
Because that's my question, sir.
Well, what do you mean by know?
Justified true belief.
I'm not claiming to know.
Anything.
What do I consider as justified true belief? I believe that, well, in that context, justified true belief, are we using my definition of true or yours?
Yours. What do you know to be true? What do you know that
I'm
corresponds?
not omniscient in that context.
Do you know that corresponds with absolute reality? Do you know that?
No.
Okay, well, that's fine. I asked him one thing, and he doesn't even know the one thing he claims to know.
What?
That's the problem. That's a problem.
Sorry.
Unfortunately, few atheists are consistent with such uncertainty. They presume they can assign probabilities in a world in which they know nothing for certain. And rather than admit their foolishness, some even dismiss philosophy rather than reconsider their certainty of atheism.
Philosophy is dead. Philosophers have not kept up with modern developments in science, particularly physics. Scientists have become the bearers of the torch of discovery in our quest for knowledge.
Hawking's specialty was theoretical cosmology, baby universes, a unified theory of everything, and higher dimensions sell books. But they are all pure conjecture.
M theory doesn't disprove God, but it makes him unnecessary. It predicts that the universe will be spontaneously created out of nothing, without the need for a creator.
Atheists tell us that it's ridiculous to believe that the God who made the universe could make a snake to speak. But what is their alternative? A universe that creates itself from nothing. Where is their empirical evidence? How does nothing produce anything, much less human consciousness? We're not supposed to ask such questions. There's a reason that in spite of all the hype, Hawking never won the Nobel Prize. He did real science in the 1970s, but much of what he promoted later in life was science fiction in the cause of what he wanted to be true. He was championed because it was what a lot of others wanted to be true as well. Most atheists never think through the absurdity of their position. They embrace unbelief because they desperately want it to be true and convince themselves of a narrative that allows them to sneer at Christians.
The more science progresses, the less need it has of God.
Atheists tell us that primitive peoples assumed that gods must be behind the phenomena they could not understand. But now science is providing naturalistic explanations. Since we understand nuclear fusion, we supposedly don't need a god to create the sun. They assure us that science is filling in all the gaps in our knowledge and will soon make belief in God unnecessary. But once again, all of this is absurd. They are assuming that God must cause something without means or else have nothing to do with it. Imagine a car moving down a road. Someone who had never seen a car might assume it was being moved by magic. Science can provide a naturalistic explanation for the car's movement. A transmission that is unseen is moving the wheels. Science can push deeper and show that the transmission is being moved by an engine and even describe the internal workings of that engine. But none of these naturalistic explanations mean that the car arose without a creator or that its movements are without direction. Though atheists have no logical basis for doing science themselves, they insist that Christians are the enemies of reason, who refuse to objectively weigh the evidence.
How do we know that these dinosaurs are hundreds of millions of years old? The answer is evidence. Tons and tons of mutually supporting evidence. Science is about testing, comparing and corroborating this mass of evidence, and using it to update old theories of how things work. Evolution by natural selection is supported by mountains of evidence, while creation contradicts the evidence and is only backed by some ancient scribblings.
Dawkins pretends that the evidence speaks for itself and determines what he believes. But the reality is that, like the scientists who supported Uri Geller, he only accepts as evidence those things that confirm what he wants to believe. The evidence for God is all around us and in us, but atheists reject God before ever considering that evidence.
I'm just interested, what sort of evidence could science or the physical universe present to you that would make you think, actually, that is evidence that there's a mind behind this?
I find that a very difficult question. If I were looking in the Bible for evidence, heaven forbid, I would expect to see maybe increase in entropy is equal to Q reversible divided by temperature. And that is
if there was literally an equation in the Bible,
equation
like
in
that.
the Bible, rather than all this wishy-washy, elastic writing that it pervades.
All right. So if there was something like that they discovered in the Bible,
then I'd think it was probably a forgery.
Anyway. Well, exactly. The problem is, would it actually make you?
No.
I mean, is there anything from is there any kind of evidence in the universe that could make? I mean, if the stars lined up to spell, Peter, please believe in me, it's about time. Would that convince you?
I put it down to madness.
Atheists begin with the assumption that any naturalistic explanation, no matter how far-fetched, is superior to one that involves Jesus being who he claimed to be.
This was again about the virgin birth, I think. Which is more likely, that the whole natural order is suspended, or that a Jewish minx should tell a lie?
atheists argue that Jesus must have never existed. If he did exist, his miracles must have been mere legend. If there was more to them, he must have been an illusionist like Geller or Popov. He could never truly have risen from the dead, so if he was crucified, he must have only appeared to die. If he really died, the disciples must have stolen the body. The fact that the disciples suffered martyrs' deaths for insisting on Jesus' resurrection is explained away by saying that people do crazy things. Such skepticism makes all knowledge impossible, but atheists only use it to dismiss what they want to ignore. For all their claims, they are not rational, objective, or scientific. Theirs is an ideology that uses an illusion of science to deceive. This is made abundantly clear if we look at atheism's creation myth, known as Darwinism. Darwinism is supposed to be real science, but science can be objectively falsified. Like Darwinism, much of what is called science cannot be falsified, because it is simply what people want to be true, masquerading in scientific language. In the 19th century, there was the pseudoscience of phrenology. A Viennese physician by the name of Franz Gall argued that our intellect and personalities are based solely on the material factors of our brains. He claimed that each could be objectively measured by the size and shape of our skulls. Though phrenologists engaged in a great deal of data collection and accurately predicted that different areas of the brain control different functions, they pushed their conclusions far beyond the evidence to prove what they wanted to believe. For example, they claimed this new scientific discipline confirmed the inferiority of non-Europeans. Robert Fitzroy, the captain of the HMS Beagle, was an ardent phrenologist who nearly rejected Darwin from the voyage to the Galapagos because of the shape of his head. Evolutionists like to contrast Fitzroy's pseudoscience with what they believe to be the hard science of Darwin. They ignore that Darwin had also been an advocate of phrenology. Many educated people were. They convinced themselves that if they were capable of doing chemistry and physics, everything they believed must be rational. But unlike real sciences, phrenology did not make predictions that could be objectively falsified. It simply interpreted data in ways that conformed to the prejudices of the phrenologist. In spite of all its claims, phrenology eventually faded into history, but other pseudosciences have arisen in its place, all demanding to be seen as true. Nearly a century after Franz Gall, another Viennese physician, Sigmund Freud, promoted his new science of psychoanalysis. As with Gall, Freud's so-called science was not falsifiable. And as with Gall, Freud developed a cult of personality by helping others justify what they wanted to believe. What Freud wanted to believe was that the cocaine he enjoyed was not addictive, that he wasn't alone in lusting after his mother, and above all, that there was no God.
The ordinary man cannot imagine this providence in any other form but that of a greatly exalted Father, for only such a one could understand the needs of the sons of men, or be softened by their prayers and placated by the signs of their remorse. The whole thing is so patently infantile, so incongruous with reality, that to one whose attitude to humanity is friendly, it is painful to think that the great majority of mortals will never be able to rise above this view of life.
Despite the aura of science that Freud projected, he confided to a friend,
I am actually not at all a man of science, not an observer, not an experimenter, not a thinker. I am by temperament nothing but a conquistador, an adventurer if you want to translate it, with all the curiosity, daring, and tenacity characteristic of a man of this sort.
The history of psychiatry since Freud has not been much better. It has promoted electroshock therapy and lobotomies. The latter was the basis of Egas winning the Nobel Prize for Medicine in 1949. In the 80s and 90s, the fad was repressed memories, and it was all supposed to be settled science. Until 1973, the American Psychiatric Association classified homosexuality as a mental disorder. But in the face of loud protest and disruptions at its conventions, it simply redefined its science. It continues to do so. In 2013, the APA ceased to identify transvestism as a mental disorder. Instead, it is now considered a mental disorder to believe that homosexuality and transvestism are disordered. In 2019, the American Psychological Association declared traditional masculinity harmful, saying it can lead to homophobia and sexual harassment. None of this is real science. It is simply progressivist morality masquerading as science. The scientific method is not subject to political correctness, and real science can be falsified. In 1919, a solar eclipse allowed Einstein's theory of general relativity to be tested. As predicted, the light of a star behind the sun was bent so as to become visible. For Richard Dawkins and his fellow evolutionists, there is no way to falsify their theories, because Darwinism is as much a pseudoscience as phrenology and psychiatry. Instead of making predictions that can be objectively tested, it makes assumptions about an unobservable past, a past very unlike the present, where life could simply spring into existence. For much of human history, the idea of spontaneous generation has had its proponents. Aristotle argued that scallops are produced from sand and oysters from slime. By the 19th century, many such ideas had been debunked, but fermentation was still considered proof that life could arise simply through exposure to air. In 1859, Louis Pasteur demonstrated that it was not the air, but microbes in the air that caused fermentation. He did so with experiments that anyone could replicate. All subsequent experiments show the same thing that Pasteur found, that life comes from life, never from non-living matter. Darwinism is not about experimentation, but imagining a warm little pond in the distant past where the right conditions somehow produce something no laboratory can replicate. Like phrenology and psychoanalysis, it is about massaging data to fit a predetermined theory. Though Darwinists pretend theirs is the obvious interpretation of this data, that is not the case.
Here's a helpful way to look at the problem Darwin faced. Climbing a mountain. Let's call it Mount Improbable. Let's say at the bottom we have the simple bacterial beginnings of life on Earth. At the top, man today, or any complicated piece of biology. So how did we get to the top? If it had happened by blind chance or by design, it would be equivalent to leaping up a sheer cliff in a single bound. Utterly out of the question.
If we come round the other side of Mount Improbable, we find something very different. Here there's no sudden precipitous cliff. Here there's a gentle slope, a gradient of evolution. All we have to do is put one foot in front of the other, and we'll get to the top.
Darwin's great insight was that life evolved steadily and slowly, inching its way gradually over 4 billion years. Natural selection, not a divine designer, was the sculptor of life.
Under the microscopes of Darwin's day, cells seemed very simple. The idea of such cells arising spontaneously and mutating into higher forms of life seemed reasonable. But modern technology has allowed us to see deep inside these cells and demonstrated a complexity far beyond anything Darwin could have imagined. Red blood cells are so small that over 150 billion could fit in a cubic inch. Besides highly complex organelles and mechanisms that Darwin never saw, in the nucleus of new blood cells is a coil of DNA that, if unwound, would stretch roughly 6 feet. The average person has about 10 billion miles of DNA in their body, enough to stretch back and forth to the sun over 100 times. The smallest genome ever discovered is in a simple bacteria, but even it has nearly 160,000 base pairs. The smallest changes in physiology that Darwinism requires involve elaborate changes in the genetic code. The gentle slope of evolution is gone, and we are back to a sheer cliff of irreducible complexity. Darwinists try to overcome that cliff with logical sleights of hand. If pesticides kill off non-resistant insects and resistant ones proliferate, this is supposed to prove Darwinism. But this involves the loss of genetic material within a population, not the additions required to make higher forms of life possible. Such reductions make up much of the supposed evidence for Darwinism. All domestic dogs descend from the wolf. Various traits were purposely bred out to produce the diversity we now have. Intentional breeding among rabbits has resulted in such variety that some can no longer successfully reproduce with one another. Darwinists point to this as the creation of new species, as if it's the same as the development of a higher form of life. But it's not. The rabbits are still rabbits, and no breeding program can change that. Countless generations of fruit flies have been raised in laboratories. Scientists managed to produce a fly with an extra set of wings, but the wings don't work, and the fly is incapable of living outside the lab. Because there are limits to biological change that make Darwinism impossible. You can breed wolves down to chihuahuas, but you cannot breed chihuahuas back to wolves, much less a dolphin or a human. Without experiments to support their theories, evolutionists turn to interpreting the fossil record. But as with other pseudosciences, their history is littered with wild exaggerations and blatant attempts at fraud. Inspired by reading The Origin of Species, German biologist Ernst Haeckel produced his own work in 1866, claiming that embryology supported Darwin. He produced detailed illustrations showing that vertebrates all developed similarly. His diagrams became standard for textbooks for well over a century. Haeckel was praised as a great scientist and founded the Association for the Propagation of Ethical Atheism. The problem was that the illustrations were fake. The images were doctored to prove what Haeckel wanted to be true. Critics pointed out his misrepresentations soon after their publication, but it would take over a century for Darwinists to admit to the fraud. In the meantime, Haeckel speculated that Indonesia would be a proper place to find the missing link between ape and man. In 1893, one of his disciples, Eugene Dubois, went to Java with the express purpose of finding that missing link. When he dug up an ape's skull cap and a human thigh bone within 40 to 50 feet of one another, he insisted that they must be from the same skeleton, and the discovery of Java Man was announced. In 1912, the New York Times reported that Darwin had been proven true, this time by the discovery of Piltdown Man. Portions of a skull were discovered in England and supposedly provided another link between apes and humans. For over 40 years, it was included in school textbooks as evidence that Darwinism was real science. Finally, in 1954, it was discovered that the skull was a hoax, perpetrated by combining a medieval human skull with the lower jaw of an orangutan and chimpanzee teeth that had been filed to fit. Someone had created the appearance of age by staining the bones with an iron solution and chromic acid. 10 years after the supposed discovery at Piltdown, Henry Osborn, the president of the American Museum of Natural History, announced yet another missing link, Nebraska Man. It fit neatly into what Osborn wanted to be true, but all his claims rested on a single tooth that eventually was revealed to belong to an extinct pig. The modern missing link is supposed to be Lucy. Everything about her skeleton was ape-like except the hip, but as with her predecessors, that hip demonstrates that Darwinism is not about following the evidence, but making the evidence fit an existing theory.
The perfect fit was an illusion that made Lucy's hip bones seem to flare out like a chimp's. But all was not lost. Lovejoy decided he could restore the pelvis to its natural shape. He didn't want to tamper with the original, so he made a copy in plaster. He cut the damaged pieces out and put them back together the way they were before Lucy died. It was a tricky job, but after taking the kink out of the pelvis, it all fit together perfectly, like a three-dimensional jigsaw puzzle. As a result, the angle of the hip looks nothing like a chimp's, but a lot like ours.
Einstein's theory made quantifiable predictions. What does Darwin's theory predict? The survival of the fittest. And how do we know which are the fittest? It's those which survive. This is not science, but a tautology. Everything supposedly proves Darwinism, yet nothing does in the same way as in the hard sciences of chemistry and physics. Darwinists claim to find simpler organisms in older rocks and more complex organisms in younger rocks. This sounds persuasive until you realize that they not only date the fossils by the rocks, but the rocks by the fossils. Darwin knew that the fossils he had available did not demonstrate gradual change over time, with a multitude of intermediate forms. But he was convinced that as more data was collected, his theory would be confirmed. The last century and a half has only strengthened the evidence that animals appear suddenly in the fossil record and remain relatively unchanged, the very opposite of what Darwin predicted. In 1972, Harvard professor Stephen Jay Gould, along with Niles Eldredge, formulated a revised theory of evolution called punctuated equilibrium. They criticized the scientific community's commitment to gradual change as based on ideology rather than real science.
The general preference that so many of us hold for gradualism is a metaphysical stance embedded in the modern history of Western cultures. It is not a high-order empirical observation induced from the objective study of nature.
They explained away the problems of the fossil record by arguing that at various points in history, mutation took place so quickly it simply was not captured in the fossil record. This leaves Darwinism without empirical testing and without the fossil record. Yet atheists still demand that it be seen as science. Though fossils are open to interpretation, there is a history to Darwinism that is much more objectively evaluated. Most American high school students have been forced to watch Inherit the Wind. Despite changing the names, the film claims to be a faithful account of the Scopes monkey trial. An earnest high school teacher is jailed and threatened by fundamentalist Christians for daring to teach evolution, contrary to Tennessee state law.
Good morning, young ladies and gentlemen. Good morning, visitors. For our science lesson for today, we will continue our discussion of Darwin's theory of the descent of man. Now, as I told you yesterday, Darwin's theory tells us that man evolved from a lower order of animals. From the first wiggly protozoa here in the sea, to the ape, and finally, to man. Now, some of you fellas out there are probably going to say that's why some of us act like monkeys. But what Mr. Charles Darwin was trying to tell us in his own way...
Bertram T. Cates.
Come off it, Sam. You've known me all my life.
Bert, you're charged with violation of Public Act 31428, Volume 37, Statute Number 31428 of the State Code, which makes it unlawful for any teacher of the public schools to teach any theory that denies the creation of man as taught in the Bible, and to teach instead that man has descended from a lower order of animals. Bertram Cates, I hereby place you under arrest.
Monkey trial. Here's another one. Monkey shines in Hillsboro. The whole world's laughing at us. Look, from Chicago. Heavenly Hillsborough. Does it have a hole in its head or its head in a hole? I'm telling you, we've gone too far.
Let 'em laugh. We fighting the Lord's battle, ain't we, Reverend? Well, I decide I'd rather have some heathen a-laughing at me than to have my sons a-laughing at my Bible.
Like so many atheist histories, this one falls apart on closer examination. Tennessee had passed a law for public schools that made it a misdemeanor to teach that humans had evolved from apes. But the governor insisted that it would never be enforced. Despite this, the American Civil Liberties Union announced that they were looking for a test case and would defend anyone accused of teaching evolution. George Rapelier was a transplanted New Yorker who managed the Cumberland Coal and Iron Company in Dayton, Tennessee. On April 5, 1925, he approached the county superintendent of schools, Walter White, and local attorney, Sue Hicks. Dayton was suffering economically at the time, and Rapelier believed that a trial would give the town some much-needed publicity. The three convinced their friend John Scopes, a 24-year-old football coach and sometimes substitute biology teacher, to be arrested for having taught evolution. Though the school's textbook included evolution, Scopes would admit after the trial that he had never actually taught it, but that was irrelevant to their plans. Scopes was arrested, but the popular coach was never jailed. The law only called for a misdemeanor fine. In the movie version, he's jailed throughout the trial and threatened with lynching.
We'll hang Bert Cates to a sour apple tree. We'll hang Bert Cates to a sour apple tree. We'll hang Bert Cates to a sour apple tree. Our Lord is marching on.
Clarence Darrow, a member of the ACLU, volunteered to defend Scopes, but told the jury the only conclusion they could reach was guilty. His hope was that the ACLU could appeal the case to the Supreme Court and have the law declared unconstitutional. When Scopes was given a $100 fine, the prosecutor, William Jennings Bryan, offered to pay it for him. Rather than reaching the Supreme Court, the conviction was later thrown out on a technicality. Rather than being a victim, John Scopes would later say,
I've often said that there is more intolerance in higher education than in all the mountains of Tennessee.
When retelling this story, atheists turn a publicity stunt into a near lynching. In seeking support for his nonprofit foundation, Richard Dawkins promises.
Number 3, change the culture. How do you do that? By sponsoring, commissioning, and producing plays and movies, helping high schools across the country put on Inherit the Wind.
Richard Dawkins is well aware of these facts, but he's still promoting Inherit the Wind. If we know that he and the Darwinists are lying to us about a history we can objectively verify, why should we trust them about any other history? Darwinists also gloss over what was taught by the textbook at the center of the controversy.
The races of man. At the present time, there exist upon the earth 5 races or varieties of man, each very different from the other in instincts, social customs, and to an extent in structure. These are the Ethiopian or Negro type, originating in Africa, the Malay or brown race from the islands of the Pacific, the American Indian, the Mongolian or yellow race, including the natives of China, Japan, and the Eskimos, and finally, the highest type of all, the Caucasians, represented by the civilized white inhabitants of Europe and America.
Considering where such thinking led, and the horrors done by Hitler in the name of helping evolution along, it shouldn't surprise us that Richard Dawkins tries to distance Darwin from him.
I should here mention the popular canard about Hitler being inspired by Darwin. It comes partly from the fact that both Hitler and Darwin were impressed by something that everybody has known for centuries. You can breed animals for desired qualities. Hitler aspired to turn this common knowledge to the human species. Darwin didn't. His inspiration took him in a much more interesting and original direction. Darwin's great insight was that you don't need a breeding agent at all. Nature, raw survival, or differential reproductive success can play the role of breeder. As for Hitler's social Darwinism, his belief in a struggle between races, that is actually very un-Darwinian. For Darwin, the struggle for existence was a struggle between individuals within a species, not between species, races, or other groups. Don't be misled by the ill-chosen and unfortunate subtitle of Darwin's great book, The Preservation of Favoured Races in the Struggle for Life. It is abundantly clear from the text itself that Darwin didn't mean races in the sense of a group of people, animals or plants connected by common descent or origin.
Is Dawkins telling us the truth? Let's see what Darwin actually said.
At some future period, not very distant, as measured by centuries, the civilized races of man will almost certainly exterminate and replace throughout the world the savage races. At the same time, the anthropomorphous apes, as Professor Schaffhausen has remarked, will no doubt be exterminated. The break will then be rendered wider, for it will intervene between man in a more civilized state, as we may hope, than the Caucasian, and some ape as low as a baboon, instead of, as at present, between the Negro or Australian and the gorilla.
Francis Galton, Darwin's cousin, had no question as to what Darwin was teaching. He incorporated these ideas into a new science that he labeled eugenics.
There is nothing, either in the history of domestic animals or in that of evolution, to make us doubt that a race of sane men may be formed who shall be as much superior mentally and morally to the modern European as the modern European is to the lowest of the Negro races.
Charles Darwin's son Leonard also seemed to be clear as to the implications. He became the head of the English Eugenics Society. But it was in the United States that eugenics became particularly popular.
Birth control is not contraception indiscriminately and thoughtlessly practiced. It means the release and cultivation of the better racial elements in our society, and the gradual suppression, elimination, and eventual extirpation of defective stocks. Those human weeds which threaten the blooming of the finest flowers of American civilization.
37 states eventually created eugenics laws, and tens of thousands of U.S. women were sterilized against their wills. Even the Supreme Court refused to intervene. But it was in Germany that Darwin's views were taken to their most hideous lengths. But atheists try to avoid this fact by claiming that Hitler was actually a Christian. They base this on him being baptized as an infant and using Christian language in his public speeches. Their reading of history is very selective. The official religion of the Nazis was called positive Christianity, but it promoted a Jesus who was neither Jewish nor divine. It was a religion in which the swastika was added to the cross, but Hitler was the voice of God. Hitler's Reich Minister of Church Affairs, Hans Kurl, described it.
Positive Christianity is National Socialism. Dr. Zöllner and Count Galin have tried to make clear to me that Christianity consists in faith in Christ as the Son of God. That makes me laugh. True Christianity is represented by the party, and the German people are now called by the party, and especially by the Führer, to a real Christianity. The Führer is the herald of a new revelation.
Hitler's head of the Nazi Party Chancellery, Martin Bormann, was even more clear in a directive to other government officials.
National Socialist and Christian concepts are incompatible. The Christian churches build upon the ignorance of men and strive to keep large portions of the people in ignorance, because only in this way can the Christian churches maintain their power. On the other hand, National Socialism is based on scientific foundations. When we National Socialists speak of a belief in God, by God we do not understand, as do naive Christians and their clerical beneficiaries, a man-like being who is sitting around in some corner of the sphere. The force which moves all these bodies in the universe, in accordance with natural law, is what we call the Almighty, or God.
It shouldn't surprise us that Hitler sought to wrap his ideology up in religious terms palatable to the populace. Hitler's private statements make his views even more clear.
You see, it's been our misfortune to have the wrong religion. Why didn't we have the religion of the Japanese, who regard sacrifice for the fatherland as the highest good? The Mohammedan religion, too, would have been much more compatible to us than Christianity. Why did it have to be Christianity with its meekness and flabbiness? Our epoch will certainly see the end of the disease of Christianity. It will last another 100 years, 200 years perhaps. My regret will have been that I couldn't, like whoever the prophet was, behold the promised land from afar.
Adolf Hitler ist unser Retter, unser Held, der edelste Führer auf der ganzen Welt. Für Hitler leben wir und wir sterben gerne wir, für den Führer bis zum Tod, denn er ist unser Gott.
Despite atheist claims, Hitler was no Christian. He was actively hostile to the Jesus of the Bible. Whether or not he should be seen as a strict atheist or a pantheist is a matter of debate. But even Richard Dawkins will sometimes admit that he really was a Darwinian.
Now, you are right when you say that aspects of what Hitler tried to do could be regarded as arising out of Darwinian natural selection. That's exactly why I said that I despise Darwinian natural selection as a motto for how we should live. I tried to say we should not live by Darwinian principles, but Darwinian principles explain how we got here and why we exist in the scientific sense.
Atheists use Darwinism to dismiss God, but then they pretend they can avoid its obvious implications. How different is Dawkins' alternative from the forced sterilization and genocide of Darwinism? It turns out not much.
The God of the Old Testament is arguably the most unpleasant character in all fiction. Jealous and proud of it, a petty, unjust, unforgiving control freak, a vindictive, bloodthirsty ethnic cleanser, a misogynistic, homophobic, racist, infanticidal, genocidal, filicidal, pestilential, megalomaniacal, sadomasochistic, capriciously malevolent bully.
Remember, this is the same Richard Dawkins who said,
"The universe we observe has precisely the properties we should expect if there is, at bottom, no design, no purpose, no evil and no good, nothing but blind, pitiless indifference."
So how does Dawkins' rage against God make sense in a universe where there is no evil and no good? It doesn't. Dawkins only argues for a materialistic universe when it suits him. Then he simply makes it disappear.
We can leave behind the ruthlessness, the waste, the callousness of natural selection. Our brains, our language, our technology make us capable of forward planning. We can set up new purposes of our own. And among these new goals can be the complete understanding of the universe in which we live. A new kind of purpose is abroad in the universe. It resides in us.
Did you ever wonder, why did the professors from Stanford want so desperately to believe in Uri Geller? Like Dawkins, they wanted to believe that, like some comic book fantasy, evolution has made some of us more than human, that they have reached the point that they can transcend materialism. The real goal of atheists has never been a universe without meaning or value. Behind all the games, they want to define good and evil, not only for themselves, but for everyone else as well. They never wanted to get rid of God so much as they wanted to put themselves in his place.
The Bible and belief in God turns out to be irrelevant. The Bible is an ancient book. It is not a book to base any truth on or any morality on. We've risen above those primitive days. We are kinder than Jesus. We are smarter than the God of the Bible. We are smarter than those people who wrote that book, and we don't need it. And millions of us know that.
Although we are puny and insignificant on the scale of the cosmos, this makes us, in a sense, the lords of creation.
Do you understand the foolishness of what Hawking was saying? He was unable to move or even to speak without the aid of a computer. He was dying, and yet he called himself a lord of creation. His self-deception goes back to a very old lie. Satan told Adam and Eve they could be more than king and queen in paradise. They could be as gods. All they had to do was to reject what God had said and define morality for themselves. They presumed they could sit in judgment over God, but they were sorely disappointed. Rather than exalting themselves to godhood, their rebellion made them slaves to sin, and they were cast out of paradise. This world of lies, rape, addiction, and murder is the fruit of our first parents thinking themselves smarter and more virtuous than their Creator. Despite all the evidence to the contrary, men have never stopped believing that they could take the place of God and regain paradise without Him. There were many gods in ancient Egypt, but the central deity was Pharaoh, a man who called himself King of Kings and Lord of Lords. He considered himself truly enlightened and claimed he was leading people to paradise through a state that promoted incest, bestiality, and homosexuality. The Apostle Paul described the pagan world.
Professing themselves to be wise, they became fools, and changed the glory of the uncorruptible God into an image made like to corruptible man, and to birds, and four-footed beasts, and creeping things. Wherefore God also gave them up to uncleanness through the lusts of their own hearts, to dishonor their own bodies between themselves, who changed the truth of God into a lie, and worshipped and served the creature more than the Creator, who is blessed forever. Amen. For this cause God gave them up unto vile affections, for even their women did change the natural use into that which is against nature. And likewise also the men, leaving the natural use of the woman, burned in their lust one toward another, men with men, working that which is unseemly, and receiving in themselves that recompense of their error which was meet.
Though the pharaohs promised exaltation to those who followed them, what they really brought was slavery. The Roman emperors, like the pharaohs, declared themselves divine and the saviors of the world. And like the pharaohs, they considered sexual license to be the mark of true freedom. The Emperor Nero's wives included not only 2 women, but also 2 men. Christians were considered the enemies of humanity because they did not indulge in such things. But the greatest crime of which Rome accused them was their refusal to worship the divinity of Caesar. Atheists in more modern times may prefer calling themselves brights or lords of creation. But like the pagan god-kings of antiquity, they do not tolerate those who refuse to see them as divine, and their state as the only true Messiah. When atheists seized power in the French Revolution, Christian worship was made illegal, and the cult of reason was declared to be the official state religion. It was an explicitly atheistic system that celebrated the people instead of God. Church buildings across France were rededicated as its temples, and the Marquis de Sade rejoiced.
The reign of philosophy has finally annihilated that of imposture. Man is finally becoming enlightened, and destroying with one hand the frivolous playthings of a divine religion, it raises with the other an altar to the divinity dearest to its heart. May filial piety, grandeur of soul, courage, equality, good faith, love of the fatherland, beneficence, may all these virtues, I say, each erected in one of our former temples, become the only objects of our homage.
Desaad had spent years in prison as a rapist and pedophile. The revolutionary government not only released him, but soon elected him a delegate to its national convention. His acceptance was symbolic of the new revolutionary morality. Sodomy was legalized in 1791 along with incest. As a celebration of atheism, a prostitute was paraded through the streets of Paris before being placed on the altar of Notre Dame Cathedral as a symbol of reason and liberty. The government no longer wanted time to be connected to the birth of Jesus, so they declared a new calendar with 1789 as year one. Sunday and the 7-day week were abolished in favor of a 10-day week, ending with a celebration of liberty, fraternity, and equality. The Protestant Reformation had produced the limited government of the English Bill of Rights. The rule of law and individual freedoms were rooted in a biblical understanding of man's sinfulness. For French atheists, they were the enlightened and answerable to no God anywhere. Rape, theft, and murder could all be justified by what they considered the greater good. Rather than ushering in a golden age of truth and freedom, atheism brought the reign of terror. Hundreds of priests and nuns were killed, and tens of thousands more fled under threat of death. Slaves were freed in the French colony of Haiti, but were then set to the slaughter of their former masters who were considered enemies of the revolution. Rather than making anyone truly free, the cult of reason made all men slaves to a messianic state. Over and over since the French Revolution, we have heard the same lie. If we just help the enlightened lords of atheism smash Christianity, a paradise will arise like a phoenix from the ashes. But their promises of reason and sexual freedom are meant to blind us to the reality. Atheism's war against God never produces its promised utopia, but inevitably brings hell to earth.
Religion is the opium of the people. The abolition of religion as the illusory happiness of the people is the demand for their real happiness. We have no compassion, and we ask no compassion from you. When our turn comes, we shall not make excuses for the terror.
Atheism is the natural and inseparable part of communism.
Like the French revolutionaries, the Bolsheviks repealed all laws against sodomy and incest in 1917.
By May 1st, 1937, there should be no one single church left within the borders of Soviet Russia, and the idea of God will have been banished from the Soviet Union as a remnant of the Middle Ages.
Stalin oversaw the creation of the League of the Militant Atheist, with 3.5 million members dedicated to the extermination of all religions in the Soviet Union.
We will substitute materialism for idealism and atheism for theism. Monks are tapeworms gnawing out the bowels of society. If you prostrate yourself before the Buddha, you are only groveling before cement. For the Onkar, there is no God, no religious beliefs, no supernatural.
The world has never before known a godlessness as organized, militarized, and tenaciously malevolent as that preached by Marxism. Within the philosophical system of Marx and Lenin, and at the heart of their psychology, hatred of God is the principal driving force, more fundamental than all their political and economic pretensions. Militant atheism is not merely incidental or marginal to communist policy. It is not a side effect, but the central pivot. To achieve its diabolical ends, communism needs to control a population devoid of religious and national feeling, and this entails a destruction of faith and nationhood.
Christopher Hitchens compared Christianity to a spiritual North Korea, while ignoring that the real North Korea is a product of atheism. It and China are officially atheistic states. Both are imprisoning Christians today. The BBC reports that as many as 2 million Chinese Muslims are currently in concentration camps, receiving forced re-education. Atheists rail against theocracies, but their alternative is always a theocracy by another name, with themselves in the place of God. Even in countries where they cannot yet declare Christianity treason, they still insist it is the root of all evil.
One of the reasons why I have the lurid subtitle I do, my book, "The Religion is a Poison," is that it makes ordinary moral people, compels them, forces them, in some cases orders them, to do disgusting, wicked, unforgivable things. There's no expiation for the generations of misery and suffering that religion has inflicted in this way and continues to inflict, and I still haven't heard enough apology for it.
There is a logical progression that goes from believing in faith, having faith that your God tells you to do something, and doing terrible deeds like suicide bombing, like flying planes into skyscrapers. The vast majority of people of faith don't do such terrible things. But those people who do terrible things do it believing that they are righteous and good, and they think that they're doing the will of their God. So they're not evil people, they're actually good people by their own lights. They believe they're doing good things, and that's why religion is evil, because it can make you do evil things believing that they are good.
Dawkins ignores what happens when men define good for themselves. He ignores the 100 million people killed in the name of atheism in just the last 100 years. He dismisses the pedophilia he experienced as a child. Instead, he insists the real immorality is raising children as Christians.
Don't ever tell a child you belong to this religion. That is child abuse.
Have you ever thought through what Dawkins is saying? If parents teaching their children religion is child abuse, then shouldn't the state stop it? But what happens when parents refuse to turn their children over to the state? What should the state do then? Every atheistic despot has argued that imprisoning and killing people was for the public good. They've argued that religion is the enemy of a rational and good society. They insist it is religion that keeps society from evolving into something better. Stalin had the power to impose his morality. What would the world look like if Dawkins had the power to impose his? We're told that such questions are unfair, because atheism is not a system, but only a negation of belief. Despite such pretenses, modern atheists not only sound a lot like one another in their positive prescriptions, but they also sound a lot like the old pagans. They've updated the packaging, but they've revived the pagan idea of spontaneous generation. They brought back the messianic states of Pharaoh and Caesar. And they continue to push the pagan view that true freedom is only found in sexual license.
So, you guys, seriously, this next thing I feel is very special. This is a cool little segment. You know this woman from Crazy Ex-Girlfriend. Please give it up for Rachel Bloom.
This one goes out to all my bipeds who identify as ladies. This world of ours is full of choice, but must I choose between only John or Joyce? Oh, it's evolution, ain't nothing new. There's nothing taboo about a sex stew. Drag queen, drag king, just do what feels right. You're tall, pansexual, flirty wood sprite.
It's exactly the right message, Rachel. Nice job.
Dawkins recognizes that moral relativism is absurd. So he insists that a moral zeitgeist has developed, where reasonable people like himself agree on what is good and evil. Besides what we've just seen, what else does such a morality entail?
Peter, I think you must be one of the most moral people in the world. You've certainly got one of the most logically thought out ethical positions in the world. And yet precisely because of its logical consistency, you seem to get a lot of flack coming from two quite different directions.
Well, that's certainly true. On the one hand, I'm critical of the attitudes that people
most people in society have towards animals. I think that we don't take the interests of animals seriously enough, and in a way I think it's an implication of Darwinism that we should take them more seriously, or at least that it breaks down some of the barriers that have separated us from animals. But on the other hand, because I don't think that humans are special just in virtue of being a member of the species Homo sapien, I think that if you have humans who are, for example, severely damaged at birth, that it's not wrong to end their lives. So I think that in some cases, human beings don't have a right to life because they don't have the possibility of having a worthwhile and meaningful life. And so, of course, I get flack from conservative moralists and conservative Christians from that perspective.
Well, that seems to me to be completely logically consistent. What about infanticide? Strictly morally, I can see no objection to that at all. I would be in favor of infanticide. But I think I would worry about, I think I would wish at least to give consideration to the person who says, well, where does it end?
And I know that Ingrid Newkirk, who's the head of People for the Ethical Treatment of Animals, has actually said that she would like her body to be eaten. She's making a statement by that, when she dies, that she would like her friends to barbecue her, because she's trying to make the point, I guess, that this is not so different from what people do. In fact, it's morally better.
Steve Gould once speculated about the possibility of a hybrid between humans and chimps, and he added that he could think of no experiment that would be more immoral to do. I couldn't get that. I mean, it seemed to me that it might be a very moral thing to do, precisely because it would have the effect of breaking the barrier of the wall around Homo sapiens.
Atheists rail against the judgments of God in the Bible. But here is Dawkins, the hero of modern atheists, arguing for cannibalism, infanticide, and the creation of human-ape hybrids. Things that sound eerily like the positions of those with whom he doesn't want to be associated. Their thinking is similar because they believe the rest of us are just animals, but they've evolved into something divine. Richard Dawkins' rage against God makes perfect sense when you realize that Dawkins is a jealous God and proud of it. When you realize that the God of the Bible judges him to be no God at all, but a pitifully small and evil creature. Do you remember what Sam Harris said?
The good news of atheism, the gospel of atheism, is essentially nothing. That nothing happens after death. There's nothing to worry about, there's nothing to fear. When after you die, you are returned to that nothingness that you were before you were born.
Atheism promises a life of fulfillment without guilt or lasting consequences. But like the promise of drugs, it's all a con. How do we find fulfillment in a materialistic universe of blind, pitiless indifference? Materialism may make it ridiculous to call anything evil, but it also makes it ridiculous to call anything good. It's a universe where there's no real basis to distinguish between helping a lady across the street and pushing her in front of a bus. It's a universe in which nothing can be considered ugly, but also one in which nothing is really beautiful. Some things may amuse us for the moment, but remember, we and all we do are nothing more than food for the worms. How long can we really distract ourselves from the meaninglessness of it all? Atheists try to transcend the emptiness of materialism and create their own meaning and value, but they quickly demonstrate themselves to be foolish substitutes for God. They promise truth, but deliver lies, because they cut themselves off from the God of truth. They promise messianic states, but only deliver tyrants, because they cut themselves off from the God of love. They promise exaltation through sex, but they only bring degradation. The truth is that whether as God kings or as lovers, other people make pitifully small and disappointing gods. Many are fooled into believing that fulfillment can eventually be found. They just need to achieve something more or get the right person in their lives. It's a dream that never becomes reality. Brad Delp was the lead singer of the rock group Boston. He had the fame, fortune, and romance that are all supposed to make life worth living. His suicide note simply read, "I am a lonely soul." Atheists have no real answers to suicide. They can offer drugs and distractions, but nothingness is often preferable to their broken promises of life apart from God. But atheists are not only lying about the here and now, they are also lying about what comes next. Instead of death bringing the promised escape, it ushers people to a judgment for which they are completely unprepared. Atheism isn't about truth, but suppressing the truth in unrighteousness. It isn't about science, but science fiction. It isn't about tolerance, but the demand that we must agree with those who consider themselves enlightened. Instead of life, what atheists really offer is death, because they cut themselves off from the God who is supposed to be our life. Atheists blame God for the pain and suffering of this world, but we are not the victims. We are the problem. God is not the monster. We are. Have you ever lied? What does that make you? God says that all liars deserve to burn in the lake of fire. Atheists say that such punishments tell us how evil the God of the Bible is, but the reality is it tells us how evil we are. We know that God commands us not to lie. So when we deceive others, we demonstrate that we love ourselves more than the God who made us and has given us everything. The reality is that unless our hearts are changed, we are all liars and hate the God of truth. No matter how much we try to convince ourselves that we're good people, with every sin we are shaking our fist at God, telling him we will not have him rule over us. It's not just the rapists and murderers that God sees as truly evil, but all of humanity. Despite how we try to deceive ourselves, we are all monsters if given the opportunity. God says that sin has given us hearts of stone, incapable of real love for him. We have filthy past with sins that demand judgment, and we are all spiritual lepers, unclean and making everything we touch unclean. The one time we had God within our grasp, we nailed him to a cross. But on that cross, Jesus died for our sins. The biblical gospel is not about men exalting themselves to become gods, but God humbling himself to become a man. Atheists feel virtuous for what they hate, but the real gospel is about Jesus, the incarnation of love, dying for those who hated him. Jesus nails our stony hearts to the cross and gives us a new heart that loves him. He bears our sins to the cross and pays their penalty so that we might receive his perfect life counted to us. He nails our poisonous life to the cross and puts his Holy Spirit in us. He offers all of this freely if we will simply repent of our rebellion and turn to him in faith. The biblical gospel is so much more than the nothingness of atheism. It is reconciliation with the God who gives light and truth in this life and for all eternity. Jesus calls us to come to him and find the rest for our souls for which we so much long. But atheists reject this reality in favor of fantasy. They seek out so-called scholars to confirm them in what they want to believe, even if what those so-called scholars say is no more honest than inherit the wind. They imagine that they are good and God is evil. They imagine that they can yet bring about paradise and make nothingness into good news. And they imagine that lies are better than the truth they don't want to face.
I'm a liar, a cheat, and a charlatan. I will blatantly lie to you but for purposes of entertainment only, of course.
The lies of atheists are meant to do more than entertain. All the deceptions, the games, and the evasions are meant to convince themselves and others of what they want to believe. The fundamental illusion of atheism, that they get to judge God, and they will never be judged by Him.